What if the real test happens after the contract is signed? When saying no costs you everything? That's the question comedian Cat Williams dared to ask when most of the industry stayed silent. And whether people agree with him or not, his words forced millions to reconsider how power really works behind Hollywood's bright lights, beyond premieres, award shows, and red carpets that shimmer with promise. Because what if success isn't just about talent? What if it's about obedience? And what if the true price of fame isn't exhaustion, criticism, or pressure, but silence? Let's start with something unsettling. Why do some actors rise effortlessly, while others vanish without explanation? Is it talent, attitude, bad luck? Or is there something else happening quietly behind closed doors? Something never mentioned in contracts, never discussed in interviews, and never confirmed publicly? According to Cat Williams, there are unwritten rules in entertainment. Rules that don't appear in scripts, emails, or negotiations. You don't see them when you're desperate for opportunity. You don't hear them when you're excited about your first big role. You only encounter them when your career is already invested, when walking away would mean losing everything you've built. And when someone refuses those rules, the punishment isn't loud. There's no press conference, no scandal, no headline screaming, blacklisted. There's just silence. Phones stop ringing. Meetings disappear. Auditions dry up. You're not banned. You're erased. And no one ever admits why. The invisible audition no one talks about. Hollywood sells dreams. That's its product. From the outside, it looks like endless possibility, a place where talent rises and effort pays off. But inside, it operates like a maze of gates, hierarchies, and unspoken expectations. Cat Williams argues that once someone breaks into the industry, the real audition begins. Not for roles, but for compliance. Can you follow instructions you don't agree with? Can you laugh when you feel disrespected? Can you trade dignity for longevity? And perhaps the most dangerous question of all, what happens when someone refuses? According to Cat, the system doesn't fight rebels. It simply starves them. No confrontation. No warnings. No explanations. Just distance. And one of the names he frequently connects to this reality is Terrence Howard. Not a struggling actor. Not an outsider. Not someone begging for opportunity. Terrence Howard was a proven star, Oscar-nominated for Hustle and Flow, box office successful, and respected for his emotional intensity and intellectual depth. He wasn't chasing Hollywood. Hollywood was calling him. So why did his career suddenly stall? Why did his name quietly fade from major casting conversations? Why was he labeled difficult, unreliable, and hard to work with, despite years of professionalism and success? According to Cat Williams, it wasn't because Howard lacked talent. It was because he refused to play by Hollywood's unspoken rules. But what exactly are those rules? And why do they matter so much? The dress, the joke, and the power behind it. Let's ask a deeper question. Why is comedy so often built on humiliation? And more specifically, why are powerful black male actors so frequently cast in exaggerated, feminized roles? This isn't about humor itself. Comedy can be healing, brilliant, and revolutionary. It can expose hypocrisy, dismantle arrogance, and speak truth to power. But Cat Williams argues that beneath certain recurring tropes, something else is happening. Something far older and far more calculated than a punchline. Historically, black men in American culture have been portrayed as physically threatening, strong, dominant, aggressive, dangerous. For generations, media narratives painted black masculinity as something that needed to be controlled, softened, neutralized. Hollywood, Cat suggests, didn't dismantle that stereotype by showing complexity. It dismantled it through ridicule. Put the strong man in a dress. Add exaggerated femininity. Turn confidence into clumsiness. Authority into absurdity. And suddenly, the man who once symbolized power becomes harmless, safe, digestible, entertaining. Have you ever noticed how often the most successful black male comedians, Eddie Murphy, Martin Lawrence, Tyler Perry, pass through that stage? Is that coincidence? Or is it initiation? According to Cat, These roles function as symbolic submission tests, not about gender expression, but about power dynamics. The message isn't, be funny. It's, show us you'll do whatever we ask. And when audiences laugh, something deeper happens. They're not just enjoying comedy. They're unconsciously participating in a hierarchy where one group defines how another group's dignity is reshaped for profit. Who benefits from that laughter? Studios make money. Networks gain ratings. Careers skyrocket. But the cultural cost is heavier. Distorted images, reinforced stereotypes, and generations taught that certain people must become jokes to survive. So the dress, Cat says, isn't harmless. It's symbolic. And Terrence Howard didn't want to wear it. Terrence Howard, when no becomes a career risk. Terrence Howard has always been intense, not just emotionally, but intellectually. He's known for thinking deeply, questioning narratives, and challenging assumptions. That intensity made his performances powerful, but it also made him resistant to roles he felt distorted reality instead of honoring it. He didn't just want success. He wanted meaning. Howard turned down biopics of icons like Smokey Robinson and Marvin Gaye, not because he didn't want the spotlight, but because he felt the scripts focused more on scandal than legacy, more on humiliation than humanity. He believed these stories stripped black greatness of its dignity, reducing cultural giants to caricatures instead of honoring their complexity. Then came roles that required behavior he felt violated his sense of self, performances that leaned into emasculation, ridicule, or humiliation. He refused. And suddenly, the phone stopped ringing. Not immediately. Not dramatically. But subtly. Scripts that once arrived weekly slowed to monthly. Meetings were postponed indefinitely. Projects evaporated without explanation. Casting conversations stopped mentioning his name. Hollywood doesn't destroy careers loudly. It starves them quietly. Terrence Howard later said the message was clear. Comply, or vanish. He chose vanish. But what he lost in money, visibility, and influence, he says he gained in dignity. And that raises an uncomfortable question. What's the real price of success if it costs your identity? And how many people say yes not because they believe in the role, but because survival demands it? Cat Williams. Crazy, or just early? 4 years, Cat Williams was dismissed as unstable. A conspiracy theorist, a troublemaker, a comedian spiraling publicly. His erratic behavior, public incidents, and unpredictable appearances made him easy to dismiss. But here's the unsettling part. What if he wasn't wrong, just early? Cat never targeted individuals for clout. His real enemy, he said, was the machinery behind the scenes, the invisible power structure that trades careers for silence and dignity for access. He once said, I've never had to step on a crack to get a check. I never had to do anything I didn't want to do. But that refusal came with consequences. When you can't silence someone directly, what's the next move? You destroy their credibility. Cat was labeled erratic, unstable, dangerous, not because he attacked people personally, but because he questioned systems. He spoke about actors being pressured into humiliating roles. He spoke about contracts that felt more like control mechanisms than career opportunities. He spoke about environments where silence was purchased instead of earned. And most disturbing of all, he spoke about power parties, NDAs, and rooms where people felt trapped by influence instead of empowered by opportunity. For years, those claims sounded extreme. But what if extreme doesn't mean false? What if it just means uncomfortable? When reality starts agreeing with the crazy guy. Cat Williams' appearance on the Club Shay Shay podcast in early 2024 wasn't just viral, it was seismic. Suddenly, his old warnings didn't feel speculative anymore. They felt predictive. He openly named powerful figures long before federal investigations made headlines. He spoke about exploitation before lawsuits surfaced. He warned about NDAs being used as weapons, and then survivors began breaking them publicly. Let's pause and ask. What happens when the person labeled unstable turns out to be accurate? How many truths were dismissed simply because the messenger made people uncomfortable? How many warnings were ignored because acknowledging them would require confronting power? Cat said 2024 would be the year of exposure. And for many in entertainment, it was. NDAs, once thought unbreakable, began collapsing. Victims chose truth over silence. Allegations surfaced. Reputations fell. The culture shifted. And suddenly, Cat Williams didn't look crazy. He looked early. And being early is often indistinguishable from being wrong, until time proves otherwise. The silence of empires. One of Cat's most controversial criticisms has involved Tyler Perry, not questioning his success, wealth, or influence, but questioning what his empire represents. Cat argues that Perry's repeated casting of black men in exaggerated feminine roles isn't accidental. He sees it as part of a broader system where masculinity is softened, reshaped, and traded for opportunity, where humiliation becomes a toll booth on the road to success. What's most striking isn't Perry's rebuttal. It's the lack of one. No lawsuits. No public debates. No press battles. Just silence. And in Hollywood, silence isn't neutrality. It's strategy. Meanwhile, murmurs from actors who worked under similar systems began surfacing. Stories of rigid expectations, unspoken boundaries, and environments where resistance quietly led to disappearance rather than dialogue. Which brings us back to Terrence Howard. Difficult. The word that ends careers. In Hollywood, the most dangerous label isn't untalented. It's difficult. That word doesn't just damage your reputation. It shuts your career down. It travels through casting offices, production meetings, and studio corridors faster than any resume. It doesn't need evidence. It doesn't need explanation. It just needs repetition. Once that label sticks, doors close quietly. For Terrence Howard, that label didn't come from missed lines or bad behavior. According to him, it came from one thing. Saying no. No to distorted portrayals. No to humiliating roles. No to stories that compromised his sense of self. And suddenly, he was hard to work with. But here's the question. Is someone difficult because they cause chaos? Or because they refuse compliance? Hollywood doesn't reward resistance. It isolates it. Terrence Howard's experience revealed something deeper. Power doesn't need to attack you. It just needs to stop feeding you. And eventually, hunger does the rest. Empire, resistance, and the price of integrity. Even at the height of his success on Empire, Terrence Howard resisted storylines that weakened his character or stripped him of authority. He challenged writers. He questioned narratives. He pushed back when scripts felt designed to humiliate rather than elevate. But resistance has consequences. Hollywood thrives on predictability. On performers who follow instructions. On stars who smile through discomfort and call it professionalism. When someone disrupts that rhythm, even politely, they become inconvenient. And inconvenient people are replaceable. While others accepted humiliating roles for awards, contracts, and career momentum, Howard chose isolation. The system responded by freezing him out, professionally, financially, culturally. But his story reveals something deeper. Hollywood may control contracts, but it doesn't control conscience. And that's where his story intersects with Cat Williams. Two men, one pattern. Cat Williams was labeled insane. Terrence Howard was labeled difficult. Different words. Same outcome. Silence. Both refused roles they believed compromised their identity. Both questioned systems instead of individuals. Both lost industry favor. Not because they lacked talent, but because they challenged power. That's not coincidence. That's pattern. And patterns don't require conspiracies. They only require incentives. Hollywood rewards compliance. Hollywood punishes resistance. And Hollywood protects itself by framing challengers as unstable, difficult, or unreliable, never as principled. So let's ask, what's more dangerous to power, a scandal or a conscience? The cost of saying yes. Not everyone who complies is weak. Some are tired. Some are afraid. Some are responsible for families, mortgages, and medical bills. The system doesn't just pressure people, it exhausts them. When survival depends on silence, morality becomes expensive. So many say yes, Not because they agree, but because they're afraid of losing everything they worked for. And that's the quiet tragedy beneath the glamour. Hollywood doesn't just cast roles. It casts choices. Choices between dignity and opportunity. Between identity and income. Between silence and survival. So when we see someone vanish, we shouldn't ask, what did they do wrong? We should ask, what did they refuse? Why silence is more effective than force. Power doesn't need violence when it has leverage. It doesn't need threats when it controls access. It doesn't need censorship when it can starve voices of oxygen. Hollywood doesn't cancel people. It forgets them. And forgetting is more devastating than outrage, because outrage still acknowledges existence. Silence erases. No headlines. No debates. No backlash. Just absence. And absence slowly rewrites history. When someone disappears, audiences assume they weren't talented enough, or disciplined enough, or stable enough. The system never has to defend itself, because it never admits it acted at all. So when Cat Williams says people are punished quietly, he isn't talking about conspiracies. He's talking about incentives. And incentives don't need meetings. They need systems. When the joke stops being funny, comedy, at its best, punches up, exposing arrogance, hypocrisy, and abuse of power. But when comedy repeatedly punches down, it stops being liberation. It becomes conditioning. Cat Williams argues that humiliation-based humor, especially toward black men, trains audiences to associate black masculinity with absurdity instead of authority, ridicule instead of respect. And when that becomes normalized, society stops questioning it. So let's ask, why are powerful black men so often portrayed as clowns before they're portrayed as kings? Why must dominance be softened before it's accepted? Why does masculinity become dangerous unless it's made laughable? And more importantly, who decides? The illusion of freedom. Hollywood sells the image of choice, endless auditions, limitless opportunity, creative freedom. But real freedom isn't about having options. It's about being able to refuse without punishment. True freedom means you can say no, and still survive. But according to Cat and Terrence, Hollywood doesn't work that way. In this system, saying no doesn't make you brave. It makes you replaceable. And replaceability is the currency of control. When someone knows they can be erased, silence becomes survival. Was Cat Williams warning us? Or confessing? Cat Williams didn't present himself as a victim. He presented himself as a witness. He never asked for sympathy. He asked for attention, not to himself, but to the system. He spoke about how comedians were pressured, how actors were cornered, how contracts were structured less like agreements and more like cages. And he spoke about what happens when someone refuses. They don't get fired. They get forgotten. But here's the question. If Cat Williams had stayed silent, would he still be wealthy? Would he still be invited into rooms? Would he still be welcomed by power? Probably. But silence wasn't his language. Truth was. And truth doesn't age well in systems built on denial. Why Terrence Howard chose disappearance over submission. Terrence Howard didn't disappear because he lacked talent. He disappeared because he chose self-respect over survival. He refused roles he felt humiliated black masculinity. He challenged scripts he felt distorted black excellence. He rejected narratives that treated dignity as optional. And in return, he lost opportunity. But he kept something else. Identity. He kept his boundaries. His sense of self. His ability to look in the mirror without regret. And that raises a question Hollywood doesn't want asked. What's success worth if you lose yourself earning it? The real question isn't, is Cat Williams right? The real question isn't whether Cat Williams is right. It's, why does his story resonate with so many people? Why do so many actors quietly echo his experiences without attaching their names? Why do so many fans feel something is wrong, even when they can't explain it? Why do so many careers fade without explanation? Why do so many powerful men suddenly become jokes? Why do so many truth-tellers become unstable in the public narrative? Why does silence always seem to win? These patterns don't require conspiracy. They require structure. And structures don't protect people. They protect themselves. The hidden cost of laughter. Every laugh at humiliation teaches someone that dignity is negotiable. Every joke built on degradation teaches someone that respect is conditional. Every role that trades identity for opportunity reinforces the idea that power owns worth. And every person who vanishes without explanation reinforces the fear that resistance equals extinction. So when Cat Williams talks about dresses, humiliation, contracts, and silence, he isn't talking about comedy. When artists refuse to submit, the system doesn't argue, it isolates. It doesn't debate their talent, their intelligence, or their right to say no. Instead, it reframes the refusal itself as instability, arrogance, or mental illness. The story becomes not they resisted, but they lost it. Not they stood their ground, but they couldn't handle fame. And once that narrative takes hold, the public stops listening. That's psychological warfare, not against bodies, but against credibility. Because if people stop trusting your mind, they stop trusting your story. And if your story disappears, your resistance disappears with it. So let's ask the question Hollywood doesn't want asked. Why does refusing humiliation feel like rebellion? Why does preserving dignity come with punishment? And why are certain groups asked to sacrifice identity for success, while others aren't? These aren't entertainment questions. They're power questions. And power doesn't like questions. The deeper question. This story isn't about dresses. It's not about comedy. It's not even about specific celebrities. It's about power. Who defines success? Who decides what's acceptable? And who pays the price when someone refuses? Power rarely announces itself. It hides behind opportunity. It disguises control as mentorship. It sells obedience as professionalism. And when someone says no, power doesn't scream, it whispers to everyone else. Don't work with them. They're unstable. They're difficult. And suddenly, the phone stops ringing. Cat Williams has argued for years that the industry runs on contracts of silence. Some written, some legal, some cultural, some psychological. He says success isn't just about talent. It's about compliance. How far will you go when power asks you to bend? And what happens when you refuse? For years, people laughed him off. He was labeled erratic, emotional, bitter, washed up. But what if he wasn't exaggerating, just early? In recent years, that balance has shifted. NDAs are breaking. Survivors are speaking. Audiences are questioning. And suddenly, what once sounded insane now sounds familiar. Cat said the system collapses when people stop being afraid of losing access. Terrence proved that walking away can sometimes preserve more than staying. But at what cost? When success disappears without explanation. Terrence once stood at the peak of his career, respected, bankable, admired. Oscar nominations, franchise roles, industry credibility. He wasn't struggling. He wasn't spiraling. He wasn't exposed in scandal. And then suddenly, the roles vanished. No meltdown. No public collapse. No tabloid implosion. Just silence. Isn't that strange? In Hollywood, careers usually die loudly, through controversy, crime, addiction, or visible self-destruction. But Howard didn't implode. He disappeared. And when outspoken voices disappear instead of failing publicly, we have to ask, is that coincidence? Or design? Howard later spoke about refusing contracts, walking away from money, rejecting roles he felt compromised his values or identity. He described conversations that made him uncomfortable, situations that crossed lines. He said he chose dignity over deals. And after that choice, nothing. No scandal, just erasure. So here's the question. Which is scarier, being fired publicly, or being erased quietly? Because public failure invites sympathy. Silent disappearance invites doubt. And doubt kills credibility. Why refusal feels like insurrection. Why does refusing humiliation feel like rebellion? Because systems built on compliance interpret boundaries as threats. If everyone else is saying yes, quietly, reluctantly, painfully, then the person who says no isn't just refusing. They're exposing the system itself. And exposure is dangerous. In any power structure, obedience is invisible. It feels normal. But resistance feels loud, even when it's silent. Especially when it's silent. Refusal doesn't just disrupt control. It disrupts the illusion of choice. Because if one person can say no, others might realize they can too. And that's when power panics. The loyalty test nobody talks about. For years, Hollywood insiders have whispered about an unspoken loyalty test. Not contracts or auditions, but compliance. According to comedians like Cat Williams and actors like Terrence, the real question isn't talent. It's obedience. How far will you go when power asks you to bend? How much of yourself will you sacrifice when opportunity knocks? And what happens when you refuse? Because refusal isn't treated as neutral. It's treated as betrayal. In a system where access equals survival, walking away isn't bravery, it's suicide. Not literal, but professional, financial, social. And that's the trap. Because when survival is on the line, consent becomes complicated. Silence becomes strategy. Compliance becomes currency. So ask yourself, if your dream career depended on enduring humiliation, would you call that opportunity? Or coercion? And if refusing meant losing everything, would your choice still feel like freedom? Enter Tyler Perry. Empire, inspiration, and power. This leads us to one of Hollywood's most powerful and controversial figures, Tyler Perry. On paper, Perry's story is inspirational. Homeless in Atlanta. Sleeping in his car. Rejected by theaters. Ignored by Hollywood. Then, against all odds, he became the first black media billionaire, building one of the largest privately owned studios in the world. He created thousands of jobs, launched countless careers, and opened doors once sealed shut. He built an empire when few believed it was possible. For many, he is a symbol of progress. But behind that triumph lies a growing storm of accusations, and questions few are willing to ask. Because power doesn't stop being power just because it's inspirational. And monopoly doesn't stop being monopoly just because it's black-owned. So let's ask the uncomfortable question. When one man controls casting, scripts, funding, distribution, marketing, and opportunity, is that empowerment or dependency? And when careers depend on one gatekeeper, is that opportunity or leverage, comedy or conditioning? Perry's signature success formula centered on comedy roles featuring exaggerated characters, often involving men in dresses, hyper-stereotyped personalities, and caricatured expressions of black life. To mainstream audiences, it was harmless entertainment. Comfort food comedy. Familiar tropes. Easy laughter. But critics argue something deeper. They argue repetition creates normalization. Normalization creates expectation. And expectation becomes identity. When the same images dominate long enough, does it stop being a joke and start becoming a cultural definition? When black masculinity is repeatedly portrayed as emasculated, clownish, hyperviolent, or emotionally stunted, what message does that send to the world? To employers? To institutions? To young black boys watching themselves on screen? And here's the deeper question. Who benefits from controlling that image? Because representation isn't just visibility, it's narrative authority. Whoever controls the stories controls the meaning of identity itself. So ask yourself, if every major role available to you required self-degradation, would you call that inclusion? Or containment? And if refusal meant career death, would you call that choice? Or coercion? The cost of speaking up. In 2023, silence cracked. A $260 million lawsuit filed by Derek Dixon accused Tyler Perry of abusing his immense power inside a closed production system. According to the filing, what began as professional mentorship allegedly evolved into coercive pressure, blurred boundaries, and manipulation tied to career advancement. This wasn't social media gossip. This was courtroom testimony. Filed paperwork. Legal claims. Financial stakes high enough to shake an empire. According to the lawsuit, Dixon alleged that opportunity came with conditions, unspoken but understood. That boundaries were crossed. That resistance came with retaliation. That career access became leverage. And whether these claims are ultimately proven or not, the pattern matters. Because Dixon's story echoed warnings Cat Williams had voiced years earlier. Hollywood deals aren't written down. You're promised opportunity, but the real currency is submission. Say yes, and doors stay open. Say no, and everything disappears. And Dixon wasn't alone. Actors like Christian Keyes and Joshua Soule shared disturbingly similar experiences. Private meetings, blurred professional lines, intense control, and retaliation when boundaries were enforced. Some didn't name names, but the patterns matched too closely to ignore. So ask yourself, when multiple voices tell the same story from different corners, is that coincidence? Or confirmation? Why victims don't walk away? Here's the darkest question of all. Why don't victims just leave? Because Tyler Perry didn't just build a studio, he built an ecosystem. For many black actors, his productions represented the only consistent path to mainstream success. Leaving Perry didn't mean quitting a job. It meant abandoning an entire future. It meant cutting yourself off from auditions, exposure, networking, financial stability, and visibility. The choice wasn't justice versus silence. It was survival versus extinction. And when survival is on the line, silence stops looking like cowardice and starts looking like strategy. So ask yourself, what would you choose if telling the truth meant losing everything? Your career, your income, your reputation, your chance to ever work again? Would you still call silence weakness or self-preservation? Because power thrives in isolation. And Perry's studio complex physically reflects that. Hundreds of gated acres. Self-contained infrastructure.